How is it possible for a driver with slower tires to outperform all his rivals in extreme conditions and still have room for more? And what does this say about Ferrari's true hidden potential in 2025? In Formula One, surprises are no longer as common as they once were. Data, simulation, and predictive analytics have turned each session into an almost calculated choreography. But every once in a while, someone breaks the script. In this case, it was Lewis Hamilton. It was Friday, October 17, 2025, and the atmosphere at Circuit of the Americas was saturated with expectations. It was the only free practice session of the sprint weekend, which meant the teams had less than an hour to understand the car's behavior, adapt settings, and most importantly, gather critical tire information. A unique opportunity to tune up before qualifying. During the first 40 minutes of the session, the 7-time world champion not only led the timetable. He did it with a lap of 1 minute and 34.857 seconds, beating Max Verstappen by more than half a second, who was running on faster tires. No strategy or track condition alone can explain that margin. The paddock was quick to react. From the McLaren garages to the screens in Maranello, all the engineers began to review telemetry in disbelief. What was happening? Why was the car that had been unable to compete in previous races now showing itself dominant, and with the slower compound? The answer was not in plain sight. It was not a radical aerodynamic evolution. There was no new rear spoiler or an update to the floor of the car. What changed was the connection between the pilot and his machine. Lewis Hamilton, for the first time this season, found that exact point where confidence, control, and aggressiveness synchronize. On a track like Coda, where high-speed corners alternate with technical sectors and demanding braking zones, finding the right balance between traction, stability, and wears a feat even more so if it is done with compounds as difficult to activate as C1. The heat of the asphalt, touching 40 degrees Celsius, turned every meter of the circuit into a threat of overheating and thermal degradation. And yet, Hamilton navigated those conditions with a naturalness that left everyone speechless. The consistency of his sectors, the control on corner exits, the smoothness of traction, and the way his SF25 responded to each turn of the wheel were signs of something special. It wasn't just pure speed. It was a declaration of intent. This was the exact point where many began to wonder, is this the true beginning of the Hamilton-Ferrari era? Were we witnessing a new chapter in F1 history? Because what happened that Friday was not explained solely by technical logic. It was something deeper. It was a warning to all rivals. But like everything in Formula One, the story was just beginning. And what seemed to be a moment of glory would soon reveal unexpected cracks. What happened in that training session was not just a knock on the table. It was a masterpiece of technical execution in conditions that any other driver would have considered unfavorable. But the true value of Hamilton's performance was not only in the stopwatch, but in how he managed to maintain the stability of the car in extreme conditions. This is where the most fascinating aspect of this story comes in. The invisible driving, the reading of the asphalt, the real-time interpretation of a car that, until that moment, had shown more uncertainties than virtues. C1 tires, by nature, have a very narrow operating temperature window. They are difficult to activate and even more difficult to maintain in their optimal range, especially when ambient temperatures are extreme like those experienced that Friday in Austin. We are talking about more than 39 degrees on the track. Conditions that usually penalize even the most balanced cars. But Hamilton didn't just get his tires into that window. He sustained them lap after lap without showing a single sign of a drop in performance. From the pit wall, Ferrari engineers analyzed the data in real time with a mixture of disbelief and admiration. The SF25 telemetry curves did not show the typical temperature peaks in the tensile phases. There was no overheating. There were no abrupt losses of grip. Hamilton had found something that other drivers simply couldn't figure out. That sector-to-sector consistency does not occur by chance. It is the result of a perfect synergy between driving style and technical understanding of the car's dynamic behavior. Hamilton was making minimal adjustments from the cockpit, modulating the power at corner exit, anticipating braking points with surgical precision, smoothing the passage through apexes so as not to overexert the tires. Every micro-decision counted, and he took them all well. But then an element appeared that changed everything. With less than half an hour left in the session, a seemingly harmless radio message broke the illusion of absolute control. The throttle pedal is really slippery for some reason. What for many would be a minor detail, for a driver of Hamilton's stature it represented a critical threat. A slippery accelerator pedal is not simply an ergonomic inconvenience. It is a failure of sensory precision. A pilot needs the pedal stroke to transmit physical feedback, for the resistance to the foot to be consistent with the engine's power delivery. Any alteration, no matter how minor, can turn progressive acceleration into an unexpected loss of traction. At Ferrari, they knew that correcting this problem required partially disassembling the pedal board, checking the anchoring mechanism, and even studying whether there was debris or any external interference. But there was no time. There were minutes of training left. And what's worse, in a few hours the sprint qualification began. With no room for deep adjustments, the team decided to keep the setup and ask Hamilton to adapt. In other words, driving blind on one of the most technical tracks on the calendar. These types of obstacles are not seen in official summaries, nor do they appear on time sheets. But for those who experience F1 from the inside, they know that it is these types of details that decide championships. Because when a driver loses confidence in his machinery, his style changes. Get up early. It doesn't go deep. Doubt. And in a category where differences are measured in thousands, hesitating means losing. As the timer entered the final stretch of the session, the teams began to change their approach. It was no longer about checking behavior in long runs or studying thermal degradation. It was time to simulate qualifying, to install softer tires and measure the true performance over one lap. In this context, Red Bull and McLaren did what was expected. They mounted the C4 soft compounds, seeking to extract every thousandth. But Ferrari took a different path. The team decided to have Hamilton start with C3 medium tires. The reason was strategic. Those were the mandatory compounds for the first two phases of the sprint qualifying, so real information under track temperature would be vital. The logic was impeccable from a technical point of view. But the execution ended up revealing a bigger problem. Hamilton completed his qualifying simulation and clocked a time of 1 minute and 33.965 seconds. Under normal conditions, that would be competitive. But not when his previous lap on hard tires had been more than a second faster. Not when rivals were breaking barriers with supposedly more efficient compounds. And much less when the final result of the session placed him in 8th position, behind cars that, in theory, should not be there. Nico Hülkenberg, driving a Sauber, a client team with fewer resources and obvious limitations, was second. Lando Norris led with an impressive lap. But what really caught the attention was not the classification itself, but the abrupt collapse of performance by Ferrari. The time degradation had no clear explanation. It wasn't due to traffic. It was not due to driving errors. And it could not be justified simply with the difference between the compounds. Something deeper was happening. Ferrari engineers, reviewing the data, found alarming inconsistencies. Not only was the average tire temperature window difficult to reach, but once exceeded, performance plummeted. The SF25 did not appear to have the ability to maintain sufficient downforce to stabilize the C3's temperature during a launched lap. The tires lost traction in the second sector, especially at the exit of turn 11 and the entrance to the complex of fast corners that leads to the main straight. And if we add to that the ergonomic problem of the accelerator pedal, the picture becomes even more worrying. Hamilton no longer trusted the power delivery. He doubted, and that doubt multiplied the impact of a car that, for some reason, seemed to change its personality depending on the compound. It went from being stable and fast in extreme conditions with the C1 to becoming an indomitable machine with the C3. A technical contradiction that no one in Maranello had foreseen. And even more important, this was the only practice session before a sprint qualifier. There was no room to correct course. There was no time to redesign the configuration. What was shown in that drop in performance was what Hamilton would have to push to the limit in the following qualifying session. With a defective pedal, with a compound that did not respond, and with a competition that already smelled blood. The paddock understood the message. Ferrari once again had speed in bursts, but he lacked the ability to sustain it. There was no consistency. There was not total control of the car in different conditions. And the worst thing, the strategic decisions, although logical on paper, were not generating results on the track. And Lewis Hamilton, the man who had amazed everyone in the first few minutes, ended the day knowing that there was still no clear answer to the most important question of all. Can Ferrari build him a car capable of sustaining his talent for an entire weekend, and not just for a fraction of it? Do you think Ferrari will be able to offer Hamilton a car that lives up to his ambition? Or are we witnessing another story of missed opportunities? The next qualifying, the next stint, the next strategic decision. Every detail counts. Because in today's Formula One, the margin for error is so narrow that even a poorly adjusted pedal can be the difference between redemption and collapse.